but I'd much rather talk fishing for the next hour and a half over this beer than get into some of the technicalities behind what's going on today in cybersecurity and what we're seeing in audits. So we'll put our hobby aside for a minute. If anybody on the call has been watching the news, y'all likely saw the slew of attacks that we've had, cyber attacks that have been publicized. Started, I'd say, into last year when the SolarWinds breach occurred.
Yep,
we had all the stuff around Microsoft on-prem Exchange. We had Colonial pipeline attack, JBS Foods attack. Was that around June probably? They just keep stacking up.
Right.
So you are the CIO of a pipeline, deemed top 100 pipeline.
Correct.
Congrats on the top 100.
We are not proud of the award.
Being the top 100 pipelines are all getting a little extra attention, how did life change post-Colonial pipeline attack?
Yeah, so just a level set for everybody. Centurion Pipeline owns and operates about 3,000 miles. We're strictly a crude pipeline. We are in Midland. We go up to Cushing, Oklahoma, and we deal in southeast New Mexico. We've got about another 3,000 miles of what we call idle pipe or idle line. For those on the phone, it was actually an acquisition out of Occidental Petroleum. So when I took over a little over almost 3 years ago, we had no infrastructure. So we started from scratch. We bought servers. We basically, and I won't, this is a bit of a plug for Center because it is, we engaged Center to help us set up our data center, get things up and running. But we had to create an environment from scratch. Right. So when we built that environment, we built it as we knew. We built it O365. We built it as we knew. When Colonial Pipeline happened, everything changed. Now, I will say that we've got a great team at Centurion and heavily focused on cybersecurity, Active Directory, redundancy, et cetera. But what happened after Colonial is the TSA got involved. Now,
who's the TSA?
The Transportation Safety Administration. So just for clarification, the TSA has always been involved with pipeline operations through what are called these corporate security reviews. Okay. But prior to Colonial, they were kind of these optional things. Pipelines didn't necessarily have to do them. Okay. But what happened after Colonial is the TSA, in conjunction, and for the record, guys, the TSA reports up to the Department of Homeland Security. So the DHS issued what's called a security directive after Colonial, which was the first time this has ever happened, specifically around pipeline cybersecurity. So the world dramatically changed because now, this is the analogy that I use to everybody, is for those who lived in a Sarbanes world and the CFOs had to sign off on financial statements. Well, guess what? About 3 weeks ago, I had to sign an attestation document saying that I had met certain requirements per the security directive. And if I didn't, I was subject to perjury under law. So it dramatically changed for folks in my role because now we're on the hook.
You're on the hook?
I hope so. You like that, don't you?
Was that a fishing pun, Brian?
Well, it was a punny fishing term, right?
That was all
you
right.
Like that? Okay.
So you mentioned that now you're on the hook. We'll come to that in a minute. I am curious about how that changes your outlook on decision making, how it is that you describe things up the stack to the CEO and the rest of your executive team. Yeah. But before we get there, what did change? Let's just say from Centurion's creation was what, 4 years ago?
3
years ago?
Approximately 3 years ago.
To now, what in your minds changed post-Colonial?
That's a good question. I think the biggest thing that's changed for me is that there's a heightened awareness by the government on our industry. And I think that's the number one change that I've seen. So now you've got this overarching group called the DHS plus TSA. Now they're kind of start invading your world and you can't escape it. And look, for the folks on this webinar, it is not going to go away. It's only going to get more and more and more intrusive because that's just how government is.
Well, I advertised this event that y'all were the first industry to be tagged by DHS. They're really not. There was 150 electrical providers that were hit by DHS prior to pipeline operators. Then you informed me before this that there was 100 pipelines that were deemed critical.
Correct.
So would you expect to see that grow in number or new industries get brought in?
That's a great question.
It's a guess.
No, I would argue that it's going to be more industries because what they're going to do is they're going to deem, for example, they're going to say, and I'll pick a name because it's in Houston. They're going to say a food service company like a Cisco is critical to infrastructure because if Cisco can't deliver food, the financial industry has been regulated heavily through Sarbanes, through lots of other rules because a lot of them are publicly traded. You have a lot of independent pipelines that aren't. But like if you think about food service delivery, and I even think that you're going to see a lot spill into water treatment and water type facilities because they're going to deem that critical infrastructure as well. So I think the tentacles have only just touched the surface personally.
I've always pictured midstream being a
You
bit.
like the tentacle reference to
I've heard it.
the
Just
sea,
didn't
the
know what
octopus?
yeah,
You
that
like
was
that?
good. That was all
I'm trying to
right.
make sure you're,
Yeah.
you're
Well,
keeping on
I
top
don't
of
want to
things.
keep the conversation on jokes. That would just be shellfish of me. Um,
That
so
was pretty good.
so the midstream industry I've always thought is a bit under the radar as far as their significance or importance
Right.
to Homeland Security. Um, do you think upstream is next in this as well?
It's a great question. I think that the government views production less important as delivery.
It's transportation.
Yeah, correct. I call it delivery transportation.
Sure.
We're saying the exact same
Sure.
thing. Yeah.
Sure.
So I think upstream, I think truly they believe that we've got giant barrels and giant tanks everywhere holding as much oil as the world needs for
Mhm.
the rest of our lives. And it's just not true. The producers have to produce, the midstream has to deliver, and at the very, very tail end, the refiners have to refine, and then way down the chain, you got to be able to buy it. I'll give you something anecdotal. What's interesting is
Like anecdotal.
we were in Montana a month and a half ago, and a friend of mine was there. When we met him, he couldn't fly out because the Bozeman airport didn't have fuel because there was a fuel shortage, and they were directing all the fuel to go to the firefighting plants in California.
Oh wow.
So it just was an interesting dichotomy. It's never happened before.
You
So,
didn't want to be trapped there.
yeah, I know. Why would I want to be trapped in Bozeman,
Right.
Montana?
That'd be terrible.
But you ask a great question. I mean, I think it's going to only continue to expand and push down.
So it wasn't until I'd say 18 months ago that Center started preaching a message of you all need a clean copy of data, a proactive threat hunter, visibility into security gaps, and then a response plan.
Mhm.
That didn't really change. We would have
No,
loved to have
that's
had
right.
that 5 years ago. We would have loved to have those four things 10 years ago. But something did change where that's more heightened. And
Mhm.
for me, it's been the sheer coverage in our media of the cyber attacks that are happening
Correct.
has led to everyone being willing to spend budget towards security.
Correct.
I remember our head of security, his name's Willie Mata. We didn't always listen to Willie 10 years ago.
Mhm.
We listen to Willie now.
Right.
Are you seeing that shift as well? Is it that there are
Mhm.
more common topics that maybe the business executives of the company are willing to listen to these ideas?
So I think the overall answer to your question is yes. My personal experience is a little bit different. So when we took over Centurion Pipeline,
Hmm.
there were several folks that were brought over from Oxy with a ton of experience. So
Hmm.
I had the luxury of being able to build a team and build an environment from scratch, which was great. However, I still had to go and prove the value to everything we were doing. And
Okay.
I'm a huge believer in value versus fear. I think too many folks today will try and, especially if they're trying to get budget dollars, will walk in and tell the CEO, if we don't do this, we will get hacked by the Russians tomorrow. And it's more authoritative. Whereas I try to be the exact opposite. I try and say, look, if we spend these dollars, we're going to get this kind of defense. And here's what it means to the business. And I always try and relate it back to the business. Now, I will say, you and I talked about this a little bit.
Hmm.
And I'm happy to go into it now. I think the table stakes for those poker players in the room,
Hmm.
the table stakes now for folks in my role is dramatically different than it was 5 years ago. I mean, it's just expected that you have a clean copy of data. It's
Right.
expected that you've got true logging at an endpoint level. It's expected that you're doing two-factor authentication.
Right.
So it's just expected you're doing things very different. 5 years ago, when I was at my last company as the CIO, two-factor authentication was kind of, not really
Sure.
everybody was doing it. Now the TSA is saying you've got to have multi-factor or two-factor authentication. So I think the table stakes have dramatically changed as well.
I tried to prepare some of the questions in advance. I'm gonna surprise you with one. Sorry.
Okay, that's all right.
There's a bit of a gap
Mm-hmm.
typically that we see between the executive team and the IT realities.
Yep.
So let's say we do have a breach and there's a business interruption. The expectation from the C-suite might be different than the reality of what IT is working with.
Right.
Um, how do you close that gap? How does that become
Yeah.
smaller?
So I I'll be I'm an open person. I usually say what I think. Gets me in trouble half the time, but I never have to remember what I say. So I think the biggest shift you have to see right now is folks that are either in a VP role or a CIO role. They've got to report directly to the CIO.
Ah,
They've got to eliminate the layers between them and the CEO. They've got to have a seat at the table with the COO, the chief marketing officer, the CFO. So I think getting that seat at the table is the number one thing, because then what you're doing is you're at that same level, and therefore you can express your concerns across the entire company.
so how does a head of IT, maybe not even a CIO title yet,
Hmm.
describe to the C-suite today that I need a seat there? How does that conversation take place? without fear.
I think it's fascinating. I think for me personally, I think that the TSA can actually help in this way. And let me explain.
Hmm.
Because the TSA is now forcing me to sign off on documents the same way our CFO has to sign off on financial statements.
Right.
So wait a minute. I'm an officer in our company. I'm on the hook now for this stuff.
Right.
So if I'm on the hook, I mean, we're all in the pool together.
Yeah.
You know?
So once the stakes rise responsibility wise, then you have to
Absolutely.
get that seat.
You do. It's not an easy thing to do though, because for so many years, folks in technology, I jokingly say this all the time, and I joke with my kids about this. We're kind of considered the plumbers, right? We keep everything going, and until a line breaks, people don't know we're around. And so I want to change that mentality.
Yeah, you're right. For decades, it's been out of sight, out of mind. It's
Correct.
better.
Correct.
In reality, now you got to be a part of it.
Absolutely.
So for anyone who's listening on the call and wondering about the chainsaw in the background, it's not a chainsaw. Just Holmes working to get back in shape. Sorry if that is distracting. Hopefully it's not. Why don't you explain real quick what is happening over there? It's kind of a fascinating process.
Yeah. So when you live on the water and have a house here, pilings are a big deal because all the houses are built on pilings.
Yeah.
And a piling is nothing more than a big giant tree that they treat. And then what they do is they drill a giant hole and they jam it in the ground, and that's what they put your boat docks and your houses on.
Nice.
So they're down there putting in boat pilings for either a new boathouse or extension of the house or whatever.
Underwater drilling?
Maybe.
It looks like it right now.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, they probably are actually. Actually, they're probably water jetting it. So what they do is they build a big water jet and they shoot the water down into the water and they basically work it down, and then the friction that just continuously pops around that piling will hold it in place. No cement, nothing. So.
All right, so back on track.
Okay.
July 20th is when the TSA announced that they were going to get into the business of IT audits. You received your audit rather quickly, right?
So
August?
So there's two components to this.
Okay.
So there's what's called the corporate security review.
Right.
And then there's security directives.
Okay.
So the corporate security review we had scheduled about 3 months ago, even ahead of Colonial, 3 or 4 months ago ahead of Colonial. We knew we needed to do it because the TSA, it's a voluntary program. When the security directives came out, they mandated it. So they said, you must do this within the calendar year. So we did our audit, but most companies who haven't done that have to do it as part of the security directive. So they're now mandated. And it was about a 200 item questionnaire that was very detailed. And here's the interesting thing. So for the folks on the webinar, it's not only about IT security. It's also about operational security. It's also about, do you have fences? Do you have cameras? How do you respond to an incident? And we think of a cyber incident, but how do you respond to for example, an active shooter in your environment? What if someone jumps your fence? So it really spans not only IT security, but also OT security, but then also into operations itself.
Interesting. Anything on that a significant surprise? Any of those questions stand out as like, why would they even go there?
Oh yeah. There was a couple, the folks on the phone, if you guys know what a PLC is, the it's called a programmable logic control. It's basically sends the signal from our pipeline and it basically operates the pipeline in layman's terms. And so they have some pretty interesting requirements around PLCs that really surprised me. By taking it down to a field device level was really surprising to me in the directive. Absolutely. Okay. Yeah.
Some of the details that we see at Center in questionnaires come from cyber insurance companies who want to do a fast audit on what your current practices are.
Yep.
I assume you go through that as well.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So last year, the cyber application took me about 15 minutes. It was about 4 questions. This year, I filled out probably 80 to 90 questions, and it got so technical that I actually had to bring folks from my team on. Yeah. I had to bring Matt and Bill and Cole and a few others from my team on to help figure out some of the answers.
Is there any symmetry there? Does the TSA's questions align with your cyber insurance questions?
Interestingly enough, they don't, because the TSA's questions, in my opinion, I've given the feedback to the TSA, I don't think they focus on the real key things. They're more worried about traffic traversing networks and isolation of networks and DMZ zones. Segmentation, whereas the cyber policies are focusing on, do you have backup? Do you do multi-factor? And the things that are more operational in nature. So frankly, I think the cyber policies are asking more relevant questions.
Interesting.
Yeah, just from what I've seen.
So you mentioned the important things. Are those the operational side then? The MFA,
I think around the operations, multi-factor is a big one. Obviously, clean data, copy backup. Yeah. But network segregation in our world, for those of for those on the webinar, we operate a pipeline. We have a SCADA system. The SCADA system is considered an operational technology system, and it must be segregated from your business network. So we have some strict demarcs where we don't allow those systems to talk to one another. So that's a pretty heavy focus of them as well.
Right, and that is a bit unique. So those of you who aren't in the midstream or anything
Right.
that has a pipeline industrial capacity to it, can you do a 30-second brief introduction of what's SCADA? What happens if that goes wrong?
So a lot. So in layman's terms, we have a control center in Houston, Texas, where we basically operate the pipeline. So what that means is we have a controller that can push a button and that will open or close a valve in the field. So we have a satellite connection that takes that signal, relays it out to the field, and will open or close a valve. So where that becomes really important is, let's say someone compromises the environment, they shut 10 valves at once, you have back pressure, you have seals that can blow, and you can have leaks. And so there's a whole host of things that can happen. It's a lot more dangerous, in my opinion, with a natural gas environment where you can have natural gas that becomes very flammable and can blow up. Crude is not as volatile, but still it can create environmental messes everywhere, especially if you're by a river or by a stream or something.
Well, you mentioned the opening or shutting of a valve. It controls PSI as well, right? The amount of pressure flowing through that pipe.
Well, the pressure is a natural function of how open or closed the valve is and how fast or how slow the upstream pump is pumping or the downstream pump is pumping.
Now, I remember in the Colonial pipeline news, that was one of the big fears. They didn't know where they were in the environment. They knew someone was in the environment. They didn't know where.
Correct.
And their fear was that they had gotten onto the OT, the operational technology side of things. And had they done that, what's the big fear? They're going to push everything to its max and blow everything up, shut everything down, and stop flow? Or what would the big fear be?
The reason I'm going to hedge my answer is because I don't know what kind of safeguards they had within their systems, because a lot of these systems have redundant controls. And what I mean by that is, if you have a pump here and a pump here, and all of a sudden they shut this pump off, this pump realizes the pressure too great, it will naturally slow itself down. So there's some checks and balances that already happen, especially around pressure. I just don't know what they had in place. I'd be ignorant if I told you I knew that. Well, I can think logically. I just don't know for sure.
Fortunately, I don't have to be near as politically correct. But there's no reason a bad actor would want to join that network and get involved if there wasn't a fear for it. No reason they'd pay a ransom quickly to try to get back out of it if there wasn't some fear of it. So even if there were safeguards in place, the fear was great enough. Now, just stick on the hot topic.
You asked me a different question. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I fully agree with what Colonial Pipeline did. They shut it down.
Yeah.
They had no idea. They had to. They had to take that course of action.
Sure.
Period. So anyways.
I like where your head's at. Shutting it down ended up causing a news story.
Absolutely.
Technically, paying the ransom didn't cause a news story, but it became a news story.
Correct.
Their ransom was pretty minor in comparison to many of the ones we hear about.
Right.
We've heard 40 million from an insurance company that got hacked. We've heard 70 million. That was, I think, the Kaseya breach. They were 4.5 million.
Wow.
Half of which the government then reached back into a virtual wallet and pulled back out, which I don't think we knew. We were led to believe it was completely anonymous.
Right.
Yeah. Blockchain. So has that become
question?
We're going to come back to that question. Hold on. Has that become a topic in the boardroom? Is that something that the group here, if they're not already talking to executives about, are we a ransom payer or are we not?
So I'm in the essence of protecting our position. I'm not going to answer that question.
You don't discuss it.
I'm not going to answer the question because the reason is because it's a catch-22. Because absolutely we'll pay a ransom. Well, boy, guess what's going to happen? No, we won't pay a ransom. Then people see it as a challenge. And so
let me rephrase it. I'm not asking if what Centurion's future looks like. It's more of does the hypothetical get played out in the boardroom?
Well, when we do our tabletop exercises, it has to.
So talk about tabletop exercise. What does that mean?
Yeah. So the one thing that we do as an organization, and again, I'm fortunate. I've got good board support for this. But if you haven't in your organization in the last year done a tabletop exercise, a threat hunt, or a pen test, go do them right now. Period. As a matter of fact, that's what we do in our environment. And I'm a bit of an anomaly in that I like, if something breaks or we find an issue, my team's really great about, hey, we found an issue, we found the problem, let's go fix it.
Yeah.
I raise that to the board, I raise that to our CEO. I tell them when we find problems.
That's the time to share it.
Absolutely.
That's what we spent the money on.
You got to share it. You got to say, look, we spent the money here, and it's no different in the pipeline industry. You have what are called ILI tool runs that go try and find integrity problems. It's the exact same concept. We're trying to find integrity problems, and it's not to get the team, but I mean, it's to go find out in the weeds, can someone get into our environment? So if you haven't done those three things, I'd recommend you do them because you're going to get support from leadership to do it.
Yeah, so shameless plug, but if you're not, probably 50% of you already are, but Center can help with all three of those areas. If those are foreign concepts to you today, well, shame on your account executive, but let us know and we'll make sure those are topics on your next meeting.
Yeah.
You said there was a question, Taylor?
Yeah, just general thought, like what is more costly, physical security or cybersecurity?
Wow. I actually thought that question was headed a different direction. So the question, I doubt they can hear you on there, right? So the question is, what's your opinion on whether or not the cost of physical security or cybersecurity has gotten more expensive for a pipeline specifically?
For a pipeline.
For a
Okay.
pipeline. And boy, those two have merged so much together. Do y'all measure the two separately?
So the answer is, I'll answer it two ways. So physical security for us in the pipeline industry, there's the number one thing is fences. Do we have fences around our environment? Do we have card access and gate access?
Okay.
And do we have cameras?
Okay.
And then do you have a maintenance program on top of that to kind of measure and monitor if all that's being taken care of? I'm going to say that cybersecurity is more recent spend, and here's why. A lot of pipelines were grown through acquisition, and so they are naturally putting fences in. They're naturally putting gates. They're naturally putting keypads. So when you buy pipelines, you naturally inherit a lot of that stuff. I would say legacy spend on physical security was way more. I would say now and future spend is probably going to be more on cybersecurity.
That's strong. Yeah. So I would agree. You're right about it seems to be all through acquisition. Big companies have them. They shed them off over time. They may gobble them right back up.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. So Taylor, was there more questions or was that the one so far? They can hear you? Wild. Careful.
Live TV.
Yeah.
Okay.
Be careful on what you say over there. Oh, that's nice. So you've not always worked in pipelines though.
No.
So any eye openers from the days of not working in pipeline where you're now saying, hey, we ought to adopt that in other industries, whatever that might be?
I think regardless of industry, and I think folks in our role, and maybe this is just me, but you got to be really transparent. You got to talk about value and not fear, and you've got to literally go to people and say, here are the table stakes. Here's all of our competitors are doing these things, and we need to go do these things because the competition is doing it. And it's just the table stakes have changed. That's my number one message. Like if you're not running a product, if you're not running like a Red Cloak or something else on your endpoints that does continuous threat monitoring, you should be doing that.
EDR.
I mean, yeah, EDR. It is. See, he uses the fancy acronym. I use the other. I use the product name.
Red Cloak, is that a fairy tale?
I don't know.
Little Red Cloak.
I don't know.
Riding Hood?
Red Riding Hood?
Yeah, never mind. Different. No,
we're in a different genre.
EDR's become so. Let's pivot again.
Let's talk about that for a second.
So we've spent our careers hardening the data center, and COVID hits, and all the data centers, everyone's coloed. Nobody's got on-prem anymore, and everyone's remote.
Right.
We saw the cyber attacks and bad actors follow that trend. They attacked remote connections like VPN and RDS. They went after schools as schools reopened. They went for schools as schools went virtual.
Colleges too.
They're also schools.
That's right.
Yeah.
They are?
Yeah, those are also schools. That's cool. So so through all that, they're looking for the low-hanging fruit. And so that proactive threat hunters giving the ability for humans to have human error in the environment and have something technical scanning and looking.
Correct.
So there's 1,000 different flavors there.
Right.
Which the fun topic that I hear a lot is I get every sales rep and under the sun talking to me about talking to me about what security tools I need to be made right.
Right.
How do you traverse that? How do you make sense of all these different tools? Buy them all?
Buy them all. I mean, I think what you have to do, and I'm a little bit different in this respect, but I really trust the team. I trust my team. I ask their opinion. I gain their input. I don't go at the lowest price. I don't go at the highest price. I go what's best for the business and what's going to defend us the best. And I hope my team will attest that when we have to look at technology, I ask them first what they think.
Sure.
There's only been a handful of exceptions where I've decided something that they didn't necessarily want to go with. It was more about hardware versus software.
Yeah.
But I will add one thing that we haven't touched on, but it kind of relates to this. So
that's allowed.
Is you sure I can pivot?
It's allowed.
Okay, thank you. The other thing I think is really important for folks to do is get grassroots with all this stuff. So, for example, several months ago, I started sitting in on all of our safety meetings.
Okay.
And so I have a cybersecurity safety minute where I talk about whatever I want to talk about. This week, I talked about the new Apple issue they're having with upgrading your iPhones, for example. I talk about our environment. I get in front of people. And I think that's really key for anybody in our role. If you're sitting in your office, especially if you work for an operations company, if you don't know the head of operations and all your regional managers and one step down from them, you're not getting out of your office enough. Get out, go listen, learn, talk, because the other way, when you talk about value, you can talk about value to the field and value to the employees.
We got a fish on.
Oh, the mullet, by the way.
Continue. Sorry.
So anyways, but I think that it's important for folks to get out and talk.
Yeah.
You know, I think it helps.
There's got to be an interesting line there about if you're in your office, hiding in your office, don't expect to be noticed.
Correct.
So the IT department's not going to get that recognition along the way for budget or whatever else you might need.
Yeah.
All right. So then let's continue down the EDR stack.
Mhm.
Now there's NDR, there's cloud detection and response, there's all these different areas.
Mhm.
Trusting the team's part of it. Some of our
Right.
members here don't have large members of teams. It's just them or one other. How much do you rely on outside your team?
Oh,
Maybe
all
a
the time.
center, but maybe others too, right?
Maybe a center.
Maybe others.
There's a fishing term. It's a lure called a plug. So that was your plug.
That was my plug.
That's
My plug. The plug's coming.
The plug's coming.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you have to rely on partners. I mean, you know, we rely on. We have multiple partners. We partner with you, a core center.
Mhm.
We have a partnership with Cisco. We have a
Mhm.
partnership with Dell.
Mhm.
And I think that different groups can offer different value. And we kind of
Right.
go to those folks. And for me, I am not, believe it or not, I am not a huge relationship type person when it comes to this kind of stuff. I go find the best solutions and the best products,
Right.
and I go with it. I'm not really enamored by that. And again, I go back to what my team and kind of how they want to do something. And there's been multiple examples that have recently played out. But to your point, we use partners all the time. I mean, Center, I will give a plug for Center. They've been very helpful to us in a lot of ways. And the best part, the thing I like about it is I can ping them with a question here and there, and we generally get really good response. And so I think you have to rely on partners. I think it's really key.
Continue. Kidding.
And I was gonna add, despite James Schuler,
Yeah.
Center has been no, I'm just kidding with you.
Center's
I'm kidding with you.
responsive, other than this guy.
Yeah, he hadn't talked to me for like 9 months and called me to do this, but I'm here though, man. I got you. We can laugh a little bit, right?
Yeah.
We're at the beach today, right?
So, is this the beach?
This
Do you-
is technically called the bay. This is the
Do you
bay.
fish the surf? Do you
Yeah.
ever do that?
Yeah.
Is that successful? I see
Sometimes.
people trying it. I never see people.
Sometimes
catch it.
I am not a huge surf fisherman, but guys and gals love it and they catch lots of fish.
You got a shark lately?
No, we don't. We try to avoid the sharks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
We catch gar. We catch big alligator gar.
Yeah.
My son's caught a couple of big ones right out here.
How big?
4 feet.
4 feet.
Yeah.
So if anyone would like to post pictures of their record gar catches on the chat, feel free. Todd, if you're still listening.
Carter, if you're listening.
Yeah. There you go. So this is too good. My big dream is that everybody in IT, they have their in-office persona. They have who they are inside that, their ways of working, their ways of thinking. But outside the office, they're a different person. And I find that too frequently, IT members specifically hide that personal side. Is there anything you can tell folks, let's say even at the sysadmin level, how do you bring your personality in without killing the role of your job? How do you be a good teammate and not take it too far?
Yeah, I mean, I think look, at the end of the day, we all go work. I mean, we're all working, we all have jobs, we all have personal lives, we all have interests. And I think the number one thing that you can do is express your interest, express who you are. Now, in the workplace, you have to be a little mindful because, especially today in the political environment. But I mean, I would argue that
What political environment?
what political environment exactly?
England?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly.
Elaborate.
Well, anyways, that's a different topic. We can talk about that later. But no, I think for me personally, I think hopefully my team will attest to this. I engage them as a person first, and I know lots about my team. We engage.
Well,
And I
like
think
Bill. Bill loves the Texans. I don't know if he likes them now, but
Bill loves the Texans.
Loves the Texans.
Yeah.
He doesn't overdo it at work though.
No. Bill loves the Texans and loves the Astros.
Yeah.
And Bill likes to barbecue.
Easy like the Astros.
Yeah. And so again, you got to get to know. At the end of the day, it is business, it is work. But I think for if you're that kind of low level sysadmin and you're comfortable doing that, be comfortable doing that.
Yeah.
It's perfectly fine.
That makes sense.
Absolutely fine.
So Taylor, put a chime in on the group chat. I'd love some Q&A and some stuff from the group if they have any questions.
It'll go to both games.
Bill goes to what? Yeah, I bet he does. He's a big tailgater too. He's a big setup. I don't
Yeah.
know if he's still doing that.